The last time I met with you, we were talking about how World War II changed life in America from a domestic level. What I'd like to talk about today is the war, and more importantly, the American foreign policy that will emerge out of World War II. In other words, when it ends. And so I want to begin in 1941. When we were talking about World War I, we were talking about alliances, and we understood that one of the causations of World War I was that European powers were all allied with one another and that drug countries that had nothing to do with one another into this fight. There's similar examples involved in World War II, but a little bit different. But I want to talk to you a little bit today about something called the Grand Alliance. In 1941, we're going to see the crystallization of what will become known as the Allied powers. Now, here's how I like to think of the Allied powers. They're the good guys, okay? The United States allies itself with Great Britain, and in addition to Britain, we also make an alliance with the Soviet Union to to Britain's east, okay? Now, this is a really important alliance, and it can be a very beneficial alliance for everybody involved. The problem is it's a very awkward alliance. Now you think about these three countries, their culture, their politics, their economy, everything. Britain and the United States have an awful lot in common, okay? The odd guy out, if you want to think of it that way, would be the Soviet Union for a lot of different reasons, but most importantly, you are talking about a communist country. We've talked about the Red Scare, we've talked about the Palmer raids, we know that America was never really all that embracing of radical doctrines in the first place, and so to ally ourselves with a country who is a communist regime was a really tough sell to the American people, okay? I'll get back to this a little bit more in just a second, but for the time being, I want to talk to you about the bad guys, right? So the Allies are the good guys. The Axis power, that would be Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan. Each of these countries had made alliances with one another, so what you've got is the Allied powers, the good guys, versus the Axis powers, the central part of Europe and then Eastern Asia, okay? So back to this whole awkward alliance with us and the Soviets. The guy running the Soviet Union is a guy named Joseph Stalin, who's a problem on a number of different levels. On the most basic level, in a lot of ways, he's an awful lot like Adolf Hitler. And it's not as if Americans did not know this. There were rumors that would later be verified after the war ended, but there were rumors of Stalin consolidating his power by just exterminating any of his political enemies. And in a lot of ways, Joseph Stalin was actually worse than Adolf Hitler when it comes to the amount of political enemies that he kills during his time as the leader of the Soviet Union. So he's a dictator in that respect. The other problem that we have when it comes to Stalin is communist ideology, which, as I pointed out before, emphasizes worldwide revolution. We know that communism doesn't just want to stay in the Soviet Union, it wants to spread across the rest of Europe, it wants to spread into Asia, Africa, the Middle East, the Far East, the Americas. It wants to go north, south, east, and west. And Joseph Stalin never shut up about the idea of, after the war, he wanted ports on the Black Sea, and he wanted territory over here, and Franklin Roosevelt can't do enough to try to keep him quiet during this period. But the simple fact of the matter was, again, this becomes very public knowledge to the American people, and it becomes a really tough sell how and why we're working with a guy like Joseph Stalin. Now, Joseph Stalin is going to become even more problematic as the war is coming to an end, and especially in the post-war period. But for the time being, he's our guy, and we need him. Reason being, he's to Germany's east. And like World War I, what Russia's doing is, the Soviet Union, I guess I should say, what they're doing is they're forcing Hitler to fight a two-front war, okay? Now, when the United States actually enters into World War II, we pursue what historians call a Germany first strategy. In other words, we perceive Germany to be the stronger enemy, which is probably pretty fair, but I would argue that the Japanese are a tougher enemy. More of that to come. Because they were a stronger enemy, we needed to focus on them first, defeat them, and then turn our attention exclusively to the Japanese. But more than anything else, what we're trying to do in 1942, 1943 is really alleviate the sufferings of both the Soviets, but especially the British, right? The British were hanging on by their fingernails when we declared war on Germany and Japan. We desperately wanted to save Britain, but we also wanted to show a sign of good faith to Joseph Stalin and the Soviets that we would open up a second front in northwestern France, and Adolf Hitler would have his hands full on both the eastern and western fronts, and that would consequently alleviate some of the suffering of the Soviet military, which was suffering mightily at the hands of the Germans. Okay. Now, there's something else that I want to point out, and I know it's going to sound like I'm getting ahead of myself, but I'm going to mention this anyway. The conference at Yalta, which a lot of people look at this as the meeting of the last, or the Big Three, the last meeting of the Big Three, that is. What I mean by that is Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, Franklin Roosevelt, the President of the United States, and Joseph Stalin, the Premier of the Soviet Union, they meet at this conference in Yalta in February 1945. Now, the purpose is to figure out the last stages of the war. How do we put this finishing touch on the war? But the agreement is that when Germany is defeated, once we get Germany's surrender, the Soviet Union will pay us back by helping finish off the Japanese. Now, it's pretty simple. What Roosevelt is trying to do here is he's trying to marginalize and minimize American casualties, the amount of people killed or wounded during war, and you can understand how and why bringing the Soviets into this fight is going to help in that respect. I want you to keep this decision that the Soviets are going to come in and help us out at Yalta. Keep that in the back of your mind as this lecture continues to unfold. So, in the spring of 1945, surrounded by enemy fire on virtually all fronts, Adolf Hitler surrenders, or he doesn't surrender, but he commits suicide, and a few days later, the Nazi Party surrenders. Now, there's obviously a lot that I haven't really covered, the D-Day invasion, the fighting in Eastern Europe, which had been done by the Soviet Union. But the real big significance that I'd like you to take away from this would be that Franklin Roosevelt dies in office. Now, in 1944, Roosevelt successfully ran for an unprecedented fourth term as President of the United States. He's making the case, and I think rightfully so, that the United States was in a state of emergency by continuing to be in the war, and therefore they needed to continue on with this consistent leadership. The thing of it was that the only person that felt that Franklin Roosevelt was well enough, like healthy, well enough to see the end of World War II was Franklin Roosevelt himself. And so in the middle of this, what we're going to see is Roosevelt's vice president is changed out. His vice presidential candidate, I guess I should say, becomes Harry S. Truman. And it's going to be Truman that's going to take over for Franklin Roosevelt, who's ultimately going to be left in charge of finishing the war with the Japanese. Now, whereas the Army had taken the lead in defeating the Germans in Europe, it's going to be the Marine Corps that's really going to have a heavy responsibility of the fighting and the dying in the Pacific. And more or less, what we're going to be doing in the Pacific is an island-hopping campaign, reclaiming all those southern and eastern Asian islands that the Japanese had colonized leading up to 1945. Now, I mentioned that Germany was the stronger enemy, and that's probably pretty fair, but Japan was certainly the tougher enemy. The reason being is there were aspects of the Japanese religion that emphasized that not only was the emperor a god, he was divine, but if you died in defense of the emperor, you went straight to heaven. And so whereas the Germans would be inclined to start waving the white flag when they could see that they were surrounded and the game was over, Japan's not going to play that game. They're going to fight you to the last man. And so even when it becomes very clear that there's no way that Japan can win this war, the very best, and that's going to be if they're very lucky, the best that they can hope for would be a draw, they're not going to surrender. Okay? Japan refuses to surrender, and it's probably also important that you understand What the United States is calling for is unconditional surrender, surrender with no strings attached. We can do what we will with you. It's a lot like what happens to the American South in the aftermath of the American Civil War. Okay. So anyway, by the summer of 1945, it's all but over, and the powers that be, including Harry Truman, have to figure out how they're going to reconstruct Europe and Eastern Asia after all the dust settles. Okay. Now, in Western Europe, and I mean France, Italy, Britain, the United States had taken the lead when it comes to doing the fighting and the dying. The Soviets had not only not fought there, they were not present there either. So when it comes to what Italy and France, Britain, what they're going to look like in the aftermath of the war, we're pretty sure we can call the shots with respect to that. I want you to understand something else. When it comes to what we want the world to look like after the war, we want a democratic world, a small d democratic world. We felt that when you gave the people of Britain, France, Italy, Germany, anywhere, the right to dictate their day-to-day lives, what that was ultimately going to do is it was going to prevent wars like World War II from ever occurring again. Now, the flip side of the coin, the Soviets had done the fighting and the dying in Eastern Europe. I mean, what defeats the Germans is this push from the United States and Britain from the west to the east, and the push from the Soviets from the east to the west, and they meet in the middle, they meet in Berlin, and that's ultimately what crushes the Nazi regime in Germany, okay? So in places like Hungary and Romania and Latvia and places that had been conquered by the German war machine leading up to 1945, it was the Soviet Union that had quote-unquote liberated places like Poland. Now here's the thing. The Soviets are going to get this reputation of being bad liberators. And what I mean by that is, yes, they do kick the Nazis out, and that's good in the sense that Poland is no longer occupied by the Germans, but the problem is they never go home, okay? Now, because they had done most of the fighting and dying in Eastern Europe, it would have been a really tough sell for the Americans to just say, look, what we're going to have in Italy is democracy. What we're going to have in Poland is also democracy, because that's just the way that it's going to be. Roosevelt needed to throw Stalin and the Soviets a bone, so to speak. And so what we pretty much did at Yalta is go ahead and concede that the Soviet Union would rebuild Eastern Europe as it saw fit, and then in return for that we would focus on Western Europe. Well, think about it. The Soviet Union is a communist regime, and it too wants to prevent wars like World War II, but instead of spreading democracy, it wants to spread communism. As far as they're concerned, if the world was communist, it would make wars like World War II less and less likely from ever happening again. So I'm pretty sure you can see where I'm going with this. What you're going to see in Western Europe is democracies, and what you're going to see in Eastern Europe would be communist regimes, and probably pretty fair to say dictatorships. Okay, the big problem would be Germany. Now, both sides had fought against Germany during the war, and both sides occupied a slice of Germany after the war. And so what the Allies decide that they're going to do is slice up Germany into quarters. The Americans will take a quarter, and the British will take a quarter, and the French, who would join the fight by this time, they'll take a quarter, and of course the Soviet Union will take a quarter. And the idea is to put Humpty Dumpty back together again, but the problem is, after the Allies kind of combine their slices, so Britain, France, and the United States go ahead and put Germany back together again, the Soviet Union is not leaving. And what you get is an Eastern Germany that is dominated by the Soviet Union and is pretty much a communist regime. And you get Western Germany, which is a democracy. And if you were to look at a map before 1989, what you would have saw is an Eastern and a Western Germany. This is the reason why. The Soviet Union never went back. And so from the outside looking in, Joseph Stalin looks like a lot like the new Adolf Hitler. He was a dictator. There was no secret about that. He was a brutal dictator at that. And furthermore, he seems bent on world domination, and clearly that can be seen in the case of what's happening with Germany. Okay. Now, all of this is leading us into our focus on the Japanese and what will ultimately be done about ending that aspect of the war. Now, keep in mind, at Yalta, we had made the decision to bring the Soviet Union into the fight after Germany had been defeated. But think about it. Do you really want the Soviets in Eastern Asia? Do you want them sniffing around places like northern China? Do you want them in places like Japan? Considering what they're doing in Eastern Europe, places like Poland, Bulgaria, let alone Eastern Germany? My guess is probably not. Now, Harry Truman, the guy that has become president after Franklin Roosevelt died, he does have another option, okay? In the months leading up to the summer of 1945, the United States government, combined with the British government, had been working on a very secret weapon, something called the Manhattan Project. Now, for your notes, the Manhattan Project was a code name for the atomic bomb. I mean, this was a weapon of mass destruction, something that had not been seen in human warfare up until this point. It could knock out entire cities, and sometimes even more than that, with one single bomb. So what we issued to the Japanese after we had successfully detonated the atomic bomb, we used it in the deserts of New Mexico, and we knew that it would work. We issued an ultimatum to the Japanese: surrender or face utter destruction. We didn't hear anything. They basically gave us the old middle finger salute. So in the summer of 1945, the Enola Gay, this bomber, the U.S. Bomber, dropped an atomic bomb on the port city of Hiroshima. We killed hundreds of thousands, over the course of time, hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians, okay? Now, once again, after we bombed Hiroshima, we issued another warning to the Japanese: surrender unconditionally or face utter annihilation. And we just didn't hear anything, okay? So after we didn't hear anything, we went ahead and dropped a second bomb on the Japanese, and this time we dropped it on Nagasaki, right? And it's in the aftermath of this second atomic bomb being dropped that we see Japan procure its unconditional surrender, and the war officially ends. And so the question, why drop not one but two bombs killing Japanese civilians in addition to military targets? Well, the answer is very complicated. On a most basic level, it's that old adage that in order to make an omelet, you're going to have to crack a few eggs. The Japanese were not going to surrender quietly. I mean, we found this out as we get closer and closer to the Japanese mainland. So as the war is beginning to become very clear that Japan cannot win it, the fighting is actually intensifying as we get closer and closer to Tokyo. Now, that being the case, if we were to invade the Japanese mainland, it would have cost astronomical amount of American casualties, let alone Japanese civilian and military casualties. So people were going to die one way or another. The other issue, and probably even more important in my own opinion, is the idea that we didn't really want the Soviet Union hanging out in Eastern Asia, okay? And so the atomic bomb offered not only a third option that would and did save American lives, it also kept the Soviet Union's role with the war with Japan to an absolute minimum. When they procured their surrender after the bombing of Nagasaki, we got to tell the Soviet Union and Joseph Stalin, look, we don't need you here. Go ahead and stay at Moscow. We don't need you. Thank you very much for your time and for your cooperation, but we've got this. We're good. And so Eastern Asia, in the aftermath of the war, because not only had we fought there, but we occupied that now, was probably going to look a lot more democratic than it was going to look any kind of communistic government. So it's important not only that you understand what's going on at Yalta with respect to the Soviet Union coming into the war, it's also very important that you understand that the United States has an ulterior motive for ending the war quickly with Japan, and it's probably a very good reason when it comes to why we decided to use the atomic bomb. Now let's talk a little bit about Harry Truman. As I said before, he was put on Roosevelt's ticket in 1944 because the powers that be felt that we needed some capable individual to take over after Franklin Roosevelt inevitably died in office. And so Truman's foreign policy is very similar to FDR. Um, Promote democracy in the post-war world, promote democracy in Africa, promote it in Eastern Asia, promote it in the Americas, and you'll see wars like this far less likely to happen. The problem that Truman has is with the Soviets, who not only are marching across Eastern Europe and not leaving, but seem bent on world domination. Okay? Now, what we're seeing emerge is something that Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister, will call the Iron Curtain. All across Europe, Eastern Europe and Central Europe anyway, what you're seeing is Joseph Stalin really moving in the Red Army and basically having a de facto military dictatorship in that part of the world. And it's cutting that part of the world off from the West. And that'll be something that will characterize something that will be called the Cold War for the next several decades. Okay? And so Harry Truman has to figure out what to do with these crazy Soviets. And the policy that Truman and his administration ultimately come up with is what we call containment policy. Okay? Now, for your notes, containment policy wants to contain communism where it already exists. And the idea is pretty simple. If you can contain it in the Soviet Union, it'll die a natural death. Once the people of those areas that are being occupied by communist regimes, once they get a taste of what communism really is like and what it entails, they'll rebel against it and overthrow it. Okay? The problem is, in various parts of the world, especially in Eastern and Southern Europe, the war had absolutely devastated the local economy, the local society. And this was particularly the case in places like Greece and Turkey that had been absolutely leveled by the war. Okay? And so what Harry Truman does is he goes to Congress and he gets approval of an American stimulus package to basically rebuild these two countries. I mean, we pumped over $400 billion collectively into both Greece and Turkey, and we pretty much rebuilt them from the ground up. And they look like glittering, shining little mini Americas. But the thing about that is once we built roads and schools and hospitals and shopping centers and things of that sort, people had jobs. And when they had jobs, they had far less time to stand on the street corner listening to these crazy communists talking about the benefits of destroying the government and implementing a communist regime. So my point with this is that by paying to rebuild both Greece and Turkey, we essentially prevented them from falling into the hands of communism. Okay? It's not during times that are really, really good that you see radicalism, including communism, thriving. It's when things are really, really bad. I mean, as a matter of fact, that's really when communism came to Russia, was the height of World War I, or I guess the depths of World War I, the suffering of the Russian people. What happened in Greece and Turkey was so successful that Harry Truman decides to take this to the next level, and what we get is the Marshall Plan. Now, for your notes, the Marshall Plan was the American initiative to pay to rebuild war-torn Europe. We were going to pay to rebuild Italy, repair Germany, Britain, France. We've included not only the Soviet Union itself, but all the countries within the sphere of Soviet influence. Okay, so again, Poland and Bulgaria, Yugoslavia. Okay, and initially Joseph Stalin comes along with this. And at the 11th hour, Stalin feels that he's being set up. And he can't allow himself to fall into what he considers to be this capitalistic trap. And so he said, not only will the Soviet Union not participate in it, nobody within our orbit of influence will participate with the Marshall Plan either. Okay? And so what you get is a Western Europe rebuilt by American money that was shining, glittering, perfect little mini examples of the United States. Roads were built, schools were built, colleges were built, people began working once again, and those economies began to come back around. It's going to take some time, but they begin to come back around. Okay? The Soviet Union can't afford to do this. And so what they have is basically a military dictatorship and an occupation, and what Poland and what Yugoslavia and even the eastern part of Germany, what it looks like is smoldering rubble, even a decade and a half after the end of the Cold War, or excuse me, after the end of World War II. Now, the Marshall Plan was brilliant in the sense that when Italy, for example, was rebuilt, it not only limited the appeal of communism, it kept communism out of Italy the same way that it did with Greece and Turkey. It also made an old World War II enemy, Italy, our new ally. I mean, you'd have to be an absolute ingrate not to befriend the country that's basically giving you free money, okay? And so Italy, Germany, and Japan, which also participated in this Marshall Plan initiative, or at least some form or fashion of it, they're going to become our new allies in a growing growing incident that's going to be known as the Cold War. The problem with the Marshall Plan, the problem with containment policy generally speaking, is that it emphasizes we'll fight any war if we see the aggressive campaign on the part of communism to spread. Now, what we're talking about is a broader initiative from Harry Truman known as the Truman Doctrine. Now, I always make the case that the Truman Doctrine is brilliant at the same time that it's stupid. How can this be the case, you ask? Well, the Truman Doctrine, there's two things that you need to know about it. First of all, it said we would pay any price. There is no price that's too expensive to prevent the spread of communism. So when it comes to rebuilding France, we'll gladly rebuild France if it means keeping the communists out. And it worked like a charm. The downside, the stupid side, is we'll fight any fight. Now, you're old enough and smart enough to know that every once in a while it makes a lot of sense to walk away from a fight. It's not worth getting into. The problem is with the Truman Plan, or excuse me, the Truman Doctrine, the United States can't do this. So when war comes to Korea and it's got clear connections to the Communist Party, the United States has no choice. It must go to war. It put itself in an ideological straitjacket. Even more problematic is when war comes to Southeast Asia and Vietnam, and there are clear connections to the Communist Party of Vietnam, the United States has to get involved. And so what the United States has basically done through the Truman Doctrine is put itself in a position where it doesn't have a lot of other alternatives. When they see the spread of communism, or even the potential spread of communism, they have to go to war, okay? I hope this makes sense, because this is part of a broader crisis that's emerging called the Cold War. Now, for your notes, what the Cold War is an ideological struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union. What the United States wants to do is spread democracy throughout the world to prevent wars. The Soviet Union is similar in the sense that it wants to prevent wars, it just wants to do so by the spread of communism. So both of these countries and societies are competing globally, internationally for influence, okay? Think of this as an international chess match where both sides are competing to be the superpower of the world in the aftermath of World War II. Now, when it comes to the early stages of the Cold War, things go very, very badly for the Americans. And in particular, 1949 is a pretty bad year, considering here we were in Washington promising the rest of the world that we are not going to see one more foot of land be ceded to the communists. And in that year, China goes over to communism. For reasons that we don't really have a lot of time to talk about, the Communist Party of Mao Zedong comes to power and expels the nationalist Chinese power, Chiang Kai-shek's power, out of the country. And when they leave, they install a communist regime in China and ally themselves with the Soviet Union. So not only do we see the spread of communism, we see the spread of communism to the most populated country anywhere in the world. This is a really bad public relations sort of incident for the United States. The only thing worse than that was 1949 is also the year that the Soviet Union had successfully detonated an atomic bomb. Now, up until 1949, we felt that we could kind of saber rattle, we could kind of bully the Soviets into doing what we wanted them to do or not to do by threatening to use the nuclear bomb. That monopoly came to an end in 1949, and so now when we said stop doing what you're doing or we're going to nuke Moscow, the Soviet Union could say that's all fine. Well, how do you feel about New York? Or how do you feel about Washington, San Francisco, Miami? okay? They could now respond in kind. And so what you're basically going to see is this standoff, this staring competition, if you will, between the United States and the Soviet Union. And fortunately, miraculously, we never actually come to blows. There's never any United States versus Soviet Union hot war, if you will. This ideological struggle will spill over into other aspects of both American foreign policy and American domestic policy. The stakes are monumental in this struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union. And that being the case, you're going to see some fairly dramatic maneuvers, some fairly dramatic policies that are coming out of Washington during this time period that will affect Americans both at home and other people abroad. And so that's where we'll pick it up when we talk about the United States and the Cold War in the next segment.